The dust devil that tore through the main street of Silverton, New Mexico territory on that sweltering August afternoon in 1883 carried with it more than just dirt and tumbleweed. It brought Clayton Mercer back into Margaret's life, and with him, a debt she never knew existed. Margaret stood on the porch of her modest homestead just outside town, watching the spiral of dust approach with a sense of dread she could not name. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 6 months now, taken by pneumonia during the harsh winter, and she had managed to keep the small ranch running through sheer determination and the help of one aging ranch hand named Pete. The chickens still laid eggs, the vegetable garden still produced enough to sell at market, and she had managed to hold on to Thomas's 3 horses by exercising them herself each morning before the heat became unbearable. At 24 years old, she had never imagined herself a widow, but life in the territories cared little for what anyone imagined. The rider emerged from the dust cloud astride a black gelding, his hat pulled low against the glare of the sun. Margaret recognized the set of his shoulders before she could make out his face, and her stomach tightened. Clayton Mercer had always made her uncomfortable, even during the brief time she had known him before marrying Thomas. Where Thomas had been gentle and thoughtful, his younger brother was sharp-edged and calculating, with eyes that never seemed to rest on anything without assessing its value. He reined in his horse at the bottom of the porch steps and tipped his hat with mock courtesy. "Margaret, looking well, I see." "Clayton." She kept her voice neutral, her hands folded in front of her apron. "I was not expecting you." "No, I imagine you were not." He dismounted with practiced ease and looped the reins around the hitching post. But here I am nonetheless. We have business to discuss." Margaret's mouth went dry. "I cannot imagine what business we might have." Clayton climbed the steps slowly, his boots heavy on the worn wood. He was 22, 2 years younger than Thomas had been, but he carried himself with an arrogance that made him seem older. "That is where you are mistaken, sister-in-law. Thomas owed me money. Quite a lot of money, actually. And now that he is gone, that debt falls to you." The words hit her like a physical blow. "That is impossible. Thomas never mentioned any debt to you." "Of course he did not." Clayton's smile did not reach his eyes. "My brother was always too proud to admit when he needed help. 3 years ago, when he was starting this place, he came to me for a loan. $2,000. I have the promissory note to prove it." $2,000. The sum was staggering. Margaret felt the porch tilt beneath her feet. "I do not believe you." Clayton reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper yellowed with age. He held it out to her, and with trembling fingers she took it. The document looked official enough, with Thomas's signature at the bottom, though the ink had faded. The terms were clear: $2,000 loaned, to be repaid with 10% interest within 5 years. According to the date, the loan would come due in 3 months. "This could be forged," Margaret said, though her voice lacked conviction. "It could be," Clayton agreed, "but it is not. You knew Thomas had money to buy this land and stock it. Where did you think that money came from? Our father certainly did not leave us anything but a reputation for drinking and bad debts." Margaret's mind raced. Thomas had told her the money came from years of saving his wages from various ranch jobs throughout Texas and New Mexico. She had never thought to question it. Why would she? But looking at Clayton's smug expression now, she felt the foundation of her understanding begin to crack. "Even if this is legitimate," she said carefully, "I do not have $2,000. I barely have enough to make it through the winter." "That is unfortunate." Clayton took the note back from her nerveless fingers. "But the debt remains. I will give you 2 weeks to come up with the money. If you cannot pay, I will be forced to take the property in settlement. The land, the house, the livestock, all of it." "You cannot do this." Margaret's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. "This is my home. It is collateral on a legitimate debt." Clayton descended the steps and untied his horse. 2 weeks, Margaret. I suggest you start thinking about where you might go when your time here is finished." He swung up into the saddle and touched his hat brim once more. "Good day to you." Margaret watched him ride away, the dust from his horse's hooves hanging in the still air long after he disappeared from sight. Her legs finally gave out, and she sank down onto the top step, the wood hot through her skirts. $2,000. She could sooner fly to the moon than raise such a sum. The ranch might be worth that much if she could find a buyer, but 2 weeks was not nearly enough time to arrange a sale, and even if it were, she would still be left with nothing. The sun beat down mercilessly as she sat there, trying to think of any possible solution. She could go to the bank, but they would never loan money to a woman with no collateral and no husband. She could try to sell the horses and livestock, but that would bring in maybe $300 at best. She could ask the neighbors for help, but most of them were struggling themselves, and the few who had money to spare would not loan it to a widow with no means of repayment. Pete found her there an hour later, still sitting on the steps with her face turned toward the horizon. "Miss Margaret, you feeling poorly?" She told him everything, watching his weathered face grow darker with each word. When she finished, he removed his hat and ran a hand through his thinning gray hair. "That snake. Begging your pardon, ma'am, but that man never was any good, even when they was boys. He was always trying to get something over on Thomas." "Do you think the note is real?" Margaret asked. Pete was quiet for a long moment. "Could be. I remember Thomas saying once early on that he had gotten help getting this place started. Never said from who, though. I just figured it was some bank back in Texas." He settled his hat back on his head. "But even if it is real, coming after a widow like this, that is low, Miss Margaret. Real low." Margaret rose to her feet, brushing the dust from her skirts with shaking hands. "I need to think. I need to figure out what to do." She spent the rest of that day and all of the next trying to conceive of some way out of her predicament. She went through Thomas's papers, looking for any evidence that might contradict Clayton's claim, but found nothing. She visited the bank in town and confirmed what she already knew: they would not help her. She even swallowed her pride and called on Mrs. Abernathy, the wealthiest woman in Silverton, only to be told in no uncertain terms that ladies of quality did not involve themselves in sordid financial matters. By the third day, Margaret was desperate enough to consider simply packing what she could carry and leaving in the night. But even as the thought formed, she rejected it. This was her home. Thomas was buried in the small cemetery on the hill behind the house. She had planted every seed in that garden with her own hands. She would not surrender it without a fight, even if she had no idea what form that fight might take. It was on the 4th day that she met Garrett Stone. She had ridden into town to sell eggs at the general store, hoping to gather a few more dollars against her impossible debt. The town was busier than usual, with ranch hands taking their monthly pay and spending it as fast as they could on whiskey and cards. Margaret tied her mare to the rail outside Henderson's general store and gathered her basket of eggs, careful not to crack any. She was so focused on her task that she did not see the drunk cowboy until he stumbled into her, knocking the basket from her hands. Eggs splattered across the dusty street, golden yolks mixing with the dirt to create a mess that drew laughter from the men lounging outside the saloon. "Watch where you're going, woman," the drunk slurred, steadying himself against a post. Margaret stared at the ruined eggs, at the basket rolling in the dust, and felt something inside her break. It was not just the loss of the morning's work or the dollar she might have earned. It was everything. Thomas's death, Clayton's threat, the crushing weight of trying to survive alone in a world that seemed designed to grind solitary women into dust. She dropped to her knees and began trying to salvage what she could, though tears blurred her vision and made the task impossible. "That was careless of you, friend." The voice was deep and calm, with a slight drawl that suggested Texas origins. Margaret looked up to see a tall man in a sand-colored duster standing beside the drunk cowboy. He wore no gun belt that she could see, but there was something in his posture that suggested he did not need one. His face was shadowed beneath his hat, but she caught a glimpse of dark eyes and sun-weathered skin. The drunk squinted up at him. "She walked into me." "I do not think that is how it happened." The tall man's tone remained conversational. I think you should apologize to the lady and then pay her for the eggs you destroyed." "The hell I will." The drunk tried to push past him, but the tall man caught his arm with one hand. It looked like a gentle grip, but the drunk's face went white, and he stopped struggling immediately. "Apologize," the tall man repeated, "and pay her." The drunk fumbled in his pocket and produced a silver dollar, which he thrust at Margaret with a muttered, "Sorry, ma'am." The tall man released him, and he scuttled away toward the saloon, rubbing his arm. Margaret stared at the silver dollar in her palm, then at the stranger who had come to her aid. He bent down and retrieved her basket, checking it for damage before handing it to her. "Not broken, at least. That is something." "Thank you," Margaret managed. "You did not have to do that." "No, ma'am, but it seemed like the right thing to do." He offered his hand to help her to her feet, and she took it, feeling calluses that spoke of hard work. Up close, she could see he was perhaps 30 years old, with dark brown hair that curled slightly over his collar and a face that might have been handsome if not for the weariness etched around his eyes. "Name is Garrett Stone." "Margaret Mercer." She brushed dust from her skirts with one hand, still clutching the basket and the silver dollar in the other. "I am grateful for your help, Mr. Stone. Just happened to be in the right place." He glanced at the broken eggs in the street. "Were you planning to sell those?" "I was." Margaret felt the tears threatening again and forced them back. But it does not matter now. Something in her tone must have caught his attention because he studied her more closely. "Forgive me for saying so, Mrs. Mercer, but you look like someone carrying more trouble than a few broken eggs." Margaret almost laughed at that. The sound came out harsh and brittle. "You have no idea, Mr. Stone." "Maybe not, but I am a good listener if you need one." She should have declined, should have thanked him again and gone about her business, but there was something in his face, a genuine kindness she had not seen in weeks, that made her hesitate. And perhaps it was simply that she had no one else to talk to, no one who might understand, that made her say, "Could I buy you a cup of coffee, Mr. Stone, as thanks for your help?" "I would like that," he said, "but the coffee is my treat. You have already lost enough today." They walked together to the small restaurant at the edge of town, a modest establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, who made the best coffee and biscuits in Silverton. Garrett held the door for Margaret, and they settled at a corner table away from the few other patrons. Mrs. Chen brought coffee and a plate of her famous biscuits without being asked, giving Margaret a knowing smile that made her cheeks warm. As they drank the strong, bitter coffee, Margaret found herself telling Garrett everything. She had not meant to. It was not proper to burden a stranger with her troubles, but once she started, the words poured out like water from a cracked dam. She told him about Thomas's death, about the long, lonely months of trying to keep the ranch going, about Clayton's sudden appearance, and his claim of the debt. She even showed him the copy of the promissory note she had made, though showing her private papers to a man she had just met seemed like madness. Garrett listened without interrupting, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When she finally fell silent, exhausted by the outpouring, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "This brother-in-law of yours," he said finally, "he gave you 2 weeks to pay?" "Yes, which is impossible, of course. I have perhaps $50 to my name. Even if I sold everything I own, I could not come close to 2,000. "What will you do if you cannot pay?" Margaret wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, seeking warmth despite the heat of the day. "I do not know. Leave, I suppose. Find work somewhere as a housekeeper or seamstress. Try to start over." "Do you want to leave?" The question was simple, but it cut to the heart of everything. "No," Margaret whispered. "That ranch is all I have left of Thomas, of the life we were building together. But wanting to stay and being able to stay are two different things." Garrett was quiet again, his fingers drumming slowly on the table. Then he said something that made Margaret's heart skip. "What if I paid the debt?" She stared at him. "I beg your pardon?" "What if I paid off this debt to your brother-in-law, $2,000? I could do that." Margaret felt heat rush to her face. Mr. Stone, I could not possibly accept such an offer. We have only just met, and I have no way to repay you. I am not asking for repayment, Garrett said, at least not in money. Margaret's stomach lurched. She started to rise from her chair, but Garrett held up his hand quickly. Wait, that came out wrong. Please, let me explain. Against her better judgment, Margaret settled back into her seat, though she kept her eyes on the door, marking the distance in case she needed to flee. Garrett leaned forward, his expression earnest. I have been working cattle drives for the past 12 years, Mrs. Mercer, living rough, saving every penny I did not spend on necessities. I have been looking to settle down, buy a place of my own, but the problem is I do not know the first thing about running a ranch. I can handle cattle, I can break horses, I can mend fence until my hands bleed, but the business side, the managing and planning and making it all work, that is beyond me. I do not understand what this has to do with me, Margaret said. You have kept your ranch running for 6 months without a husband. That tells me you know how to manage a place. What I am proposing is a partnership. I pay off your debt and help work the ranch. You teach me how to run it properly. We split any profits. Nothing more than that. It was a strange proposal, possibly even scandalous, but Margaret could not deny it had a certain logic to it. Still, she shook her head. Mr. Stone, you cannot just give away $2,000 to a stranger. What if I simply took your money and told you to leave? You would not do that. Garrett said it with such certainty that Margaret blinked. You cannot know that. You have known me for all of an hour. I am a good judge of character, Mrs. Mercer. I have had to be to survive this long, and I can see you are an honest woman in a bad situation. Besides, he smiled slightly. If I am wrong, I suppose I will learn an expensive lesson about trusting strangers, but I do not think I am wrong. Margaret studied him across the table. This mysterious cowboy who had appeared out of nowhere with an impossible offer. Why would you do this? There must be 100 ranches you could buy with $2,000. Maybe, but most of them would not come with someone who already knows how to make the place work. Garrett turned his coffee cup slowly on the saucer. Truth is, Mrs. Mercer, I am tired. Tired of the trail, tired of moving from place to place, tired of living out of a bedroll. I want something permanent. And when I saw you standing there in the street looking like the whole world was against you, I thought maybe we could help each other. It was madness. Margaret knew it was madness, but it was also the only offer she had received and time was running out. If we did this, and I'm not saying we will, but if we did, there would have to be rules. Of course. You would have your own room in the bunkhouse with Pete. There would be no impropriety of any kind. Agreed. And the ranch would remain in my name. I will not risk losing it again because of someone else's claim. Naturally. And if at any point this arrangement is not working, you will leave peacefully. You have my word on it. Garrett extended his hand across the table. So do we have a deal, Mrs. Mercer? Margaret looked at his hand for a long moment. Weathered and honest. The hand of a working man. She thought of Clayton's smirking face, of the empty house waiting for her, of the grave on the hill where Thomas rested. Then she thought of giving it all up, of walking away from the only home she had known as a married woman. She reached out and clasped Garrett's hand. We have a deal, Mr. Stone. They spent the rest of that afternoon working out the details at the bank. Garrett had an account in Denver with more than enough to cover the debt, and he arranged for a transfer of funds to the Silverton Bank. The banker, a nervous man named Holloway, seemed scandalized by the arrangement, but could find no legal reason to prevent it. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Margaret had a receipt showing that $2,000 would be available within 3 days. Your brother-in-law gave you 2 weeks, Garrett said as they stood outside the bank. When does he expect an answer? He said he would return in 14 days to collect. That gives us 10 days yet. Then I suggest we make him wait the full time, Garrett said. Let him think he has won. Makes it all the sweeter when he finds out otherwise. Margaret felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest, something that might have been hope, or might have been simply the relief of not facing her problems alone anymore. Will you come out to the ranch now? You should see what you are investing in. I would like that, Garrett said. Let me settle up at the hotel and get my horse. I will follow you out. The ride back to the ranch was strange for Margaret. She kept glancing over her shoulder to confirm that Garrett was really there, really following her home on a rangy buckskin gelding that looked like it had seen more miles than most horses ever would. The whole day had taken on a dreamlike quality, and she half expected to wake up and find herself still sitting on the porch steps, broken by Clayton's news. But Garrett was solid and real as he dismounted in her yard, and Pete came out of the barn to eye the stranger with obvious suspicion. Margaret made the introductions, explaining the arrangement they had made. Pete's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline, but he was too polite to voice his doubts in front of Garrett. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose we could use the help. Winter will be here before we know it, and there is plenty needs doing to get ready." Margaret showed Garrett around the property as the sun painted everything gold and amber. The house was small but well built, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room. The barn could hold 6 horses comfortably, though they currently had only 3, plus Margaret's mare. There were chicken coops, a root cellar, a spring house, and about 100 acres of land, half of it suitable for grazing. "Thomas wanted to build the herd up," Margaret explained as they walked the fence line. "He planned to buy more cattle this fall, but then he got sick." "It is a good piece of land," Garrett said, his eyes taking in everything with the practiced assessment of someone who knew ranching. "Water access is good, grass is decent. With some work, this could be a fine operation." They returned to the house as dusk settled over the valley. Margaret lit the lamps and found herself suddenly unsure what to do with this stranger who was now her business partner. Propriety dictated that he should sleep in the bunkhouse with Pete, but hospitality suggested she should at least offer him supper. "I have stew from last night I could warm up," she said. "It would not be much, but you are welcome to it." "That sounds fine, ma'am, but only if you let me earn my keep. I am handy in the kitchen if you need help." They worked together in the small kitchen, Margaret heating the stew while Garrett sliced bread and set the table. It was oddly comfortable, more comfortable than it should have been with someone she had known for less than a day. When Pete came in, drawn by the smell of food, the 3 of them sat down to eat together. Over the meal, Garrett told them something of his history. He had been born in Texas, lost his parents to cholera when he was 15, and had been working cattle ever since. He had been on drives from Texas to Kansas, from Montana to Colorado, and had seen more of the West than most men twice his age. "Why did you never settle before now?" Margaret asked. Garrett was quiet for a moment, his fork paused over his plate. "I guess I was looking for the right place, the right reason." His eyes met hers across the table. "Maybe I just found it." After supper, Garrett carried his bedroll out to the bunkhouse while Margaret cleaned up. She stood at the kitchen window watching the lamp glow from the small outbuilding and wondered what she had gotten herself into. Thomas had been dead for only 6 months. What would people say about her taking in a strange man, even with Pete there as a chaperone? What would the church ladies whisper behind their hands? But as she dried the last plate and set it on the shelf, Margaret found she did not care as much as she should have. Let them whisper. They had not been there when Clayton threatened to take everything. They had not offered to help. Garrett Stone had done more for her in one afternoon than the entire town of Silverton had done in 6 months of widowhood. The next days fell into a rhythm that surprised Margaret with its easiness. Garrett proved to be as good as his word, rising before dawn to help Pete with the morning chores and working until dusk on the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch running. He repaired the sagging barn door, replaced rotted fence posts, and cleaned out the spring house. He was quiet and steady, never complaining, never asking for anything beyond his meals and a place to sleep. Margaret found herself watching him when she thought he would not notice. The way he moved with unconscious grace, the patience he showed with the horses, the gentle humor he used with old Pete. He was nothing like Thomas, who had been slight and bookish, more comfortable with a ledger than a lasso. But there was something solid about Garrett, something that made her feel safe for the first time since the winter had taken her husband. On the 5th day, she found him in the barn attempting to repair a broken harness and clearly struggling with the leather work. She smiled and took the harness from his hands. "Let me show you. You have to wet the leather first, make it pliable." She demonstrated the technique, aware of his attention on her hands, his closeness in the confined space of the barn. When she handed the harness back, their fingers brushed, and Margaret felt a jolt that had nothing to do with static. "Thank you," Garrett said quietly. "I am better with rope than leather." "Everyone has their strengths." Margaret stepped back, suddenly needing distance. "You have been a great help already, Mr. Stone." "I wish you would call me Garrett. Mr. Stone makes me feel like my father." "Only if you call me Margaret," he smiled, and it transformed his face, erasing some of the weariness and revealing the younger man beneath. "Margaret it is." They worked in companionable silence after that, Margaret showing Garrett the intricacies of leather repair while the afternoon light slanted through the barn doors. It was peaceful and ordinary, and somehow more intimate than any conversation could have been. That evening, as Margaret prepared supper, she found herself humming, something she had not done since Thomas died. The realization stopped her cold, guilt washing through her. How could she be humming while her husband was barely 6 months in the ground? How could she feel this lightness, this relief, this strange anticipation every time Garrett walked into a room? But the guilt faded as quickly as it had come, replaced by something Thomas himself had told her once. "Life is for the living, Maggie. Do not ever forget that." The 10th day arrived with a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Margaret woke with knots in her stomach, knowing that tomorrow would bring Clayton back to collect what he thought was his. She and Garrett had planned it carefully. The money had arrived from Denver and sat in an account at the bank, but they had not sent word to Clayton. They would let him come, let him think he had won, and only then reveal that the debt was paid. Margaret spent the morning cleaning the house, needing something to do with her nervous energy. Garrett found her scrubbing the kitchen floor on her hands and knees and gently took the brush from her hands. "You're going to wear a hole straight through to the foundation," he said. "Come outside. There is something I want to show you." He led her to the corral, where he had saddled both her mare and his buckskin. "We are going riding?" "You have been cooped up here worrying for a week and a half. A ride will do you good." Margaret hesitated. "I should not. There is so much work." "The work will wait. Come on." They rode east into the foothills, following a trail Margaret knew well. It led to an overlook where you could see the entire valley spread out below. The ranch, a neat collection of buildings in the distance. Thomas had proposed to her here, she remembered, but the memory did not hurt as much as it once had. Garrett dismounted and helped Margaret down from her mare, his hands steadying her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. They stood at the edge of the overlook, the wind tugging at their clothes. "Beautiful country," Garrett said. "Yes?" Margaret wrapped her arms around herself. "Thomas and I used to come here sometimes to plan, to dream. He was a lucky man." "I'm not sure he would have agreed, given how things turned out." Garrett turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Margaret, I have been meaning to say something, but I have not been sure of my place." "What is it?" "Tomorrow, when your brother-in-law comes, I want you to let me handle him." Margaret stiffened. "I can deal with Clayton myself." "I know you can. But men like him, they think they can push around women who have no one to stand with them. I want him to know that you are not alone anymore." There was something in the way he said it that made Margaret's breath catch. "Garrett, I'm not trying to take over," he said quickly. "It is your ranch, your life, your decision. But I made you a promise when I paid that debt. Not just that I would help with the work, but that I would stand between you and anyone who tried to hurt you. That includes your brother-in-law." Margaret looked into his face, at the determination there, and felt something shift inside her chest. "All right," she said softly. "We will face him together." They rode back to the ranch in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, full of things that did not need to be said yet. That night, Margaret lay awake in her room, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around her. Somewhere in the bunkhouse, Garrett was probably also awake, preparing himself for tomorrow's confrontation. She found comfort in knowing he was there, in knowing she would not have to face Clayton alone. She found more than comfort in it if she was being honest with herself, but that was a thought for another day. Clayton arrived at precisely noon the next day, as if he had timed his entrance for maximum dramatic effect. Margaret saw him coming from the kitchen window and called out to Garrett, who had been working in the barn. By the time Clayton dismounted in the yard, both Margaret and Garrett were standing on the porch waiting for him. Clayton's smile faltered slightly when he saw Garrett, but he recovered quickly. "Margaret, I see you have hired help. I hope you did not spend what little money you had left on wages. You are going to need every penny for your travels." "Hello, Clayton," Margaret said, pleased that her voice remained steady. "I want to introduce you to Garrett Stone. He is my new business partner." "Business partner?" Clayton's smile turned mocking. "How enterprising of you, sister-in-law. But I'm afraid your business is about to change hands, unless you have $2,000 hidden somewhere." "The debt is paid," Garrett said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the yard like a whip crack. Clayton's head snapped toward him. "What did you say?" "The debt is paid, in full with interest. Mrs. Mercer owes you nothing." For a moment, Clayton just stared at them. Then he laughed, though there was no humor in it. "That is impossible. She does not have that kind of money." "I do," Garrett said. "I paid the debt 5 days ago. The bank has the receipt." The color drained from Clayton's face, then flooded back in an angry red. "You have no right to interfere in family business. Your business with Mrs. Mercer concluded the moment the debt was satisfied. She does not owe you money. She does not owe you explanations, and she does not owe you the time of day." Clayton descended from his horse and stalked toward the porch, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip. Garrett's posture did not change, but something in his eyes made Clayton's hand freeze. "You are making a mistake," Clayton said, directing his words at Margaret. "This ranch should have been mine. Thomas promised you nothing," Margaret said, finding her voice. "He built this place with his own hands, and he left it to me. Whatever you thought you were owed, it is settled now. You need to leave, Clayton. This is not over." Clayton's voice shook with rage. "That note was legal. I could take this to court." "You could try," Garrett said, "but the debt has been paid and you accepted payment. Any judge would laugh you out of the courtroom. Now I believe the lady asked you to leave." "And who are you to tell me what to do?" Clayton's hand moved back toward his gun. "You are nothing but some drifter she led into her bed." Garrett moved so fast that Margaret barely saw it. One moment he was standing still. The next, he had descended the porch steps and seized Clayton by the front of his shirt, lifting him almost off his feet. Clayton scrabbled for his gun, but Garrett caught his wrist in an iron grip. "Listen carefully," Garrett said, his voice dangerously soft. "You are going to get on your horse and ride away from here. You are never going to come back. You are never going to threaten Margaret again. You are never going to speak ill of her to anyone, because if you do any of those things, if you so much as think about causing her trouble, I will find out. And when I do, you and I will have a conversation you will not enjoy. Do you understand me?" Clayton tried to pull away, but Garrett held him effortlessly. "You cannot threaten me. I will go to the sheriff." "Go ahead. Tell him that a man defended a widow from your extortion. See what he says." Garrett released him with a slight push that sent Clayton stumbling backward. "Get out, now." For a moment, Margaret thought Clayton might actually try to draw his gun. His face was twisted with rage and humiliation, his hand hovering over the weapon. But whatever he saw in Garrett's eyes made him think better of it. He backed toward his horse, never taking his eyes off Garrett. "This is not over," he said again, but the words lacked conviction. "You have not heard the last of me." "Yes, we have." Garrett crossed his arms over his chest. "Because you are a coward, Clayton Mercer. You tried to steal from a widow because you thought she could not fight back, but she can, and now you know it. So take your threats and your false notes and whatever dignity you have left, and do not ever show your face here again." Clayton hauled himself into the saddle with shaking hands. He looked at Margaret, and she saw something in his face, hurt maybe, or genuine anger. Thomas would be ashamed of you," he said. "No," Margaret replied, her voice clear and strong. "Thomas would be ashamed of you. Now go." They watched him ride away, the dust from his horse's hooves rising into the clear air. Margaret's hands were shaking, adrenaline flooding her system now that the confrontation was over. She gripped the porch railing to steady herself. Garrett climbed the steps slowly, his eyes searching her face. "Are you all right?" "I am fine. Margaret's voice cracked. "I cannot believe it is really over." "It is over. He will not be back." "How can you be sure?" "Because men like Clayton only fight battles they know they can win. He knows now that he cannot win this one." Margaret looked at him, at this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to pray. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for the money, for standing with me, for making him leave. You do not have to thank me." Garrett reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I meant what I said. I will stand between you and anyone who tries to hurt you. That is not going to change." The touch of his hand on her face sent warmth through Margaret's entire body. She knew she should step back, should maintain the proper distance between them, but she did not want to. She wanted to lean into that touch, to let herself feel safe in a way she had not felt since Thomas died. Pete's voice from the barn broke the moment. "Everything all right out here?" Garrett dropped his hand and stepped back. "Everything is fine, Pete. Clayton will not be bothering us anymore." The old ranch hand emerged into the sunlight, squinting at them. "Good riddance to bad rubbish, I say. That boy never was any account." The rest of that day passed in a strange mixture of relief and tension. Relief that Clayton was gone, that the threat to the ranch had been eliminated, but tension too, an awareness between Margaret and Garrett that had not been there before, or had been there but unacknowledged. Margaret caught herself watching him over supper, noticing the way his hands moved, the sound of his voice, the rare smiles that softened his weathered face. That night, she dreamed of Thomas. He stood in the bedroom doorway looking just as he had before the illness took him, young and healthy with his ready smile and gentle eyes. "You deserve to be happy, Maggie," he said. "Do not wait for permission from ghosts." She woke with tears on her face, but they were not entirely sad tears. The dream had felt like a blessing, like Thomas releasing her from the chains of grief and guilt she had been wearing for 6 months. The following weeks brought a subtle shift in the household. The work continued. The ranch ran smoothly, but the careful distance Margaret and Garrett had maintained began to erode. They found excuses to work together more often. Their conversations grew longer, more personal. Garrett told her about his childhood in Texas, about the mother who had taught him to read from the only book they owned, a battered copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. Margaret told him about growing up in Missouri, about the journey west with her parents, about meeting Thomas at a church social in Santa Fe. They were careful not to let their growing closeness become obvious to Pete or to the handful of neighbors who occasionally stopped by. Margaret was still a recent widow, and scandal was the last thing she needed. But alone, working side by side in the barn or the garden, they let the barriers fall inch by careful inch. One evening in late September, with the air turning crisp and the aspen leaves beginning to gold, Garrett found Margaret sitting on the hillside where Thomas was buried. She had brought wild flowers to put on the grave, and she sat with her arms wrapped around her knees, looking out at the valley. "May I join you?" Garrett asked. Margaret nodded, and he settled onto the grass beside her, not touching but close enough that she could feel his warmth. They sat in silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Do you think I am terrible?" Margaret asked suddenly, "for moving on so quickly?" "No." Garrett's answer was immediate and certain. "I think you are surviving. That is not terrible. That is human." The ladies in town would not agree. The ladies in town have not walked in your shoes. They have not had to keep a ranch running alone, or faced losing their home, or buried someone they loved. They do not get to judge you." Margaret turned to look at him. In the fading light, his profile was strong and honest. "When did you become so wise?" "I have had a lot of time alone to think. Trail drives are good for that. Hours and hours with nothing but your thoughts and the sky." He paused. "Margaret, I need to tell you something." Her heart began to beat faster. "What is it?" "When I offered to help you, I told you it was because I wanted to settle down, to learn to run a ranch properly. That was true, but it was not the whole truth." "What is the whole truth?" Garrett picked a blade of grass and twisted it between his fingers. "The whole truth is that I saw you standing in that street looking lost and angry and scared, and I thought you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. Not just your face, though that is plenty pretty, but the way you stood, the strength in you even when everything was falling apart. I wanted to know you. I wanted to help you. And I told myself it was just about the ranch, just about finding a place to settle, but I was lying to myself." Margaret's breath caught. "Garrett, let me finish, please." He looked at her now, his dark eyes intense. "I know it is too soon. I know you are still grieving. I know people would talk. But I need you to know that what I feel for you, it is real. It is not some business arrangement or convenience. You matter to me, Margaret. More than I expected. More than I probably should admit." The words hung in the air between them, vulnerable and honest. Margaret's mind raced. She should tell him it was impossible, that she needed more time, that propriety demanded they maintain distance, but all she could think about was the way her heart lifted every time she saw him, the way his presence made the house feel less empty, the way she had started imagining a future that included him. "It is too soon," she said finally. "You are right about that. Thomas has been gone less than a year." "I know. And people would talk. They would say I did not love my husband, that I am desperate or loose or worse. I know that too. But," Margaret took a deep breath, "but I need you to know that you matter to me as well. I am not ready for anything more yet. I am not ready to move forward, but I think someday I might be. And when that day comes, if you are still here, if you still feel the same way—" "I will be here," Garrett said. "I will wait as long as it takes." They sat together on the hillside until the stars came out, not touching, just being close. It felt like a promise, Margaret thought. A promise of something good waiting in the future. When enough time had passed, when the grief had softened enough to make room for something new. The winter that year was mild by New Mexico standards, with only a few storms that left more than a foot of snow. The ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. Pete continued to handle the day-to-day livestock care, though his arthritis was clearly worsening. Garrett took on the heavier work, repairing the barn roof before the storms hit, cutting enough firewood to last through February, breaking ice on the water troughs every morning when the temperature dropped. Margaret managed the household and the business end of the ranch, keeping careful accounts of every penny spent and earned. The ranch turned a small profit that year. Nothing spectacular, but enough to prove it could be viable with proper management. Christmas came and went with a quiet celebration. The three of them sharing a goose that Garrett had shot and Margaret had roasted with herbs from her garden. In February, Pete announced that his sister in California had written asking him to come live with her. And while he hated to leave, his bones could not take another New Mexico winter. "I will miss you terribly," Margaret told him as she helped him pack his few belongings. "You have been such a help to me." "You are going to be fine, Miss Margaret," Pete said, his old eyes twinkling. "You got that Garrett Stone now. He is a good man, that one. You hold on to him." "Pete!" Margaret felt her cheeks heat. "It is not like that." "Sure it is not." Pete patted her hand. "I am old, not blind. That man looks at you like you hung the moon, and you look at him the same way when you think nobody is watching. Life is too short to waste on propriety, Miss Margaret. You remember that." He left on a bright March morning with promises to write and Margaret's tears dampening his shirt. The ranch felt emptier without him, but it also felt more intimate, just Margaret and Garrett now, alone, except for the handful of times neighbors stopped by or they went into town for supplies. They were careful, still, about propriety. Garrett slept in the bunkhouse, ate meals at the main house, and worked from dawn until dusk on the endless tasks of ranch life. But the careful distance had eroded almost completely. They worked side by side more often than not, their conversations ranging from practical matters to philosophy to dreams for the future. One April evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Garrett said, "It will be a year soon." Margaret knew exactly what he meant. May 12th. That is when Thomas died. "Are you doing all right with the anniversary coming up?" She considered the question seriously. "I think so. I will always love Thomas. He gave me a home, a life, a purpose. But the sharp edge of grief has dulled. I can remember the good times now without breaking down. I can think about the future without feeling guilty." "That is good." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "Margaret, I know we talked about waiting, about giving it time, but I need to know. Do you think there might be a future for us, as more than business partners?" Margaret turned to look at him, this steady, patient man who had appeared in her life when she needed him most. "Yes," she said simply. "I think there might be." Garrett's face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen on him. "Then I can wait however long you need. Just knowing there is a chance, that is enough." But Margaret discovered she did not want to wait anymore. Life was uncertain, death could come at any time, Thomas had taught her that. And here was Garrett, solid and real, and looking at her like she was the answer to every question he had ever asked. "Garrett," she said, "would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow night? A real dinner, not just the two of us eating because we are hungry. A dinner like we are courting." His smile grew even wider. "I would like that very much." They planned it carefully. Garrett rode into town and bought a bottle of good wine and a box of fancy chocolates. Margaret spent the afternoon cooking Thomas's favorite meal, roast beef with potatoes and carrots, biscuits with honey butter, apple pie for dessert, and then caught herself and changed the menu. This was not about Thomas anymore. This was about her and Garrett and whatever they might build together. So she made chicken with herbs instead, the way her mother used to prepare it, and a lemon cake she had never attempted before. Garrett came to the door at precisely 6 o'clock. Dressed in his best shirt and trousers, his hair slicked back and still damp from washing. He presented Margaret with the chocolates and wine with a flourish that made her laugh. "You look beautiful," he said, and the way he said it made her believe him. They ate by candlelight, talking about everything and nothing, letting the conversation flow naturally. After dinner, they moved to the porch with glasses of wine, sitting close together as the stars emerged overhead. "I never thought I would feel this way again," Margaret confessed. "After Thomas, I thought that part of my life was over." "What part?" "The part that feels hope, that looks forward to tomorrow instead of just dreading it. The part that gets excited at the thought of someone's smile." She looked at him. "You gave me that back, Garrett. You gave me back the future." Garrett set down his wine glass and took her hand. The first time he had really touched her since that day on the hillside, his hand was warm and calloused, utterly different from Thomas's soft scholar's hands, but equally dear. "Margaret," he said, "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." "All right. Will you marry me?" The question hung in the air, huge and terrifying and wonderful. Margaret's first instinct was to say it was too soon, that people would talk, that she needed more time. But then she looked at Garrett's face, open and hopeful and patient, and she realized none of those things mattered. Pete had been right. Life was too short to waste on propriety. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Garrett let out a breath that might have been a laugh or a sob or both. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "You have made me very happy." "Good, because you have made me happy too." They were married 6 weeks later, on a bright June morning in the small church in Silverton. Margaret wore her best dress, not the black mourning clothes she had worn for a year, but a blue cotton dress that brought out the color in her eyes. Garrett wore a new suit, ordered special from Denver. Mrs. Chen stood as witness, along with the storekeeper, Mr. Henderson, and his wife. The church ladies clucked their tongues about the unseemly haste of the wedding, but Margaret found she did not care. She had Garrett at her side, solid and real, promising to love her and stand by her for the rest of their lives. That was worth more than all the approval in the world. The wedding night was gentle and nervous and sweet. Garrett was patient with Margaret's shyness, and she found that being with him was different from being with Thomas, but no less meaningful. They fit together in a new way, building something unique to them. Life on the ranch continued, but now there was joy in it. Garrett moved his things from the bunkhouse into the main house, into Margaret's room, and waking up beside him each morning felt like a gift. They worked together, planned together, dreamed together. In August, Garrett announced he had bought 3 head of breeding cattle from a rancher in Colorado. "Not much," he said, "but it is a start. In a few years, we could have a decent herd." Margaret threw her arms around him, delighting in his surprise. "You are a wonderful man, Garrett Stone." "I am just a man who loves his wife," he replied, kissing her thoroughly. In October, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. She had been tired lately, queasy in the mornings, and when she finally admitted to herself what it might mean, the joy was mixed with fear. What if something went wrong? What if she lost this baby like so many women did? What if she was not ready to be a mother? But when she told Garrett, he swept her into his arms and spun her around, laughing with pure delight. "We are going to have a baby, a family." His joy was infectious, and Margaret found her fears fading. They would face whatever came together. That was the promise they had made. The winter was harder that year, with storms that lasted days and temperatures that dropped well below zero. But the house was snug, the firewood was plentiful, and Margaret spent her days knitting small clothes while Garrett worked on building a cradle from pine wood he had carefully saved. In February, during a brief warm spell, a rider came to the ranch. Margaret saw him from the window and felt her stomach tighten. She recognized the horse, the way the man sat in the saddle. Clayton. Garrett was in the barn, and Margaret considered going to get him. But something in the set of Clayton's shoulders, in the way he dismounted slowly and carefully, made her hesitate. He looked thinner than she remembered, older. His clothes were dusty from hard travel. She met him on the porch, keeping her distance. "Clayton, I thought we made it clear you were not welcome here." "I know." His voice was hoarse. "I know I have no right to be here, but I needed to see you, to apologize." Margaret crossed her arms over her swollen belly. "Apologize?" "Yes." Clayton took off his hat and twisted it in his hands. "For everything. For trying to take your ranch, for the lies, for the cruelty. You were right about Thomas. He would have been ashamed of me." "What changed?" Margaret asked, not ready to forgive, but willing to listen. "I went to Texas. Thought I would try my luck down there. Use the money I had saved to start over. But everywhere I went, I kept thinking about what you said, what that cowboy of yours said, that I was a coward who preyed on widows." Clayton looked up at her, and she saw real pain in his eyes. "I did not like what I saw in the mirror anymore, so I came back, not to ask for anything, just to say I am sorry. You did not deserve what I tried to do to you." From the barn, Margaret heard Garrett's voice calling her name. Clayton heard it too and took a step back toward his horse. "I should go. I just wanted you to know I am sorry. Truly sorry. And I hope you're happy here." He glanced at her belly. "Looks like you are building a good life. That is more than I can say." "Clayton, wait." Margaret descended the porch steps slowly. "I appreciate you coming here. I appreciate the apology. But you need to understand. You cannot be part of our lives. What you did, the threat you posed, that broken trust, we cannot get past that." "I understand." Clayton put his hat back on. "I just needed to say the words, so you would know." Garrett emerged from the barn, his face dark when he saw Clayton, But Margaret held up a hand and he stopped, trusting her to handle it. "Goodbye, Clayton," Margaret said. "I hope you find what you are looking for. I hope you become the man Thomas thought you could be." Clayton nodded once, mounted his horse, and rode away. This time Margaret felt no fear watching him go, only a kind of sad relief. Whatever chapter Clayton represented in her life, it was truly closed now. "What was that about?" Garrett asked, coming to stand beside her. Margaret leaned into his warmth, his strength. "Ghosts," she said, "saying goodbye." Their daughter was born on a rainy night in late May, a year and a month after Thomas's death. The labor was long and difficult, with only the help of Mrs. Chen, who had delivered half the babies in Silverton. But when Margaret finally held her daughter in her arms, red-faced and squalling and perfect, she felt something inside her heal that she had not even known was broken. Garrett cried when he held his daughter for the first time, tears streaming down his weathered face as he counted tiny fingers and toes. "She is beautiful," he whispered, "just like her mother." They named her Sarah Rose. Sarah for Garrett's mother, Rose for the wildflowers that grew on the hillside where Thomas was buried. It felt right to acknowledge both the past and the present, to honor what had been while celebrating what was. The years that followed were good ones. Not easy. Nothing about ranch life was easy, but full of love and purpose. Sarah grew into a sturdy, laughing child with her mother's determination and her father's steady temperament. When she was 3, a son was born, James Thomas, named for both his grandfathers. 2 years after that came another girl, Emily, who had her father's dark eyes and an independent streak that promised future trouble. The ranch prospered slowly but steadily. Garrett's cattle venture proved successful, and within 5 years they had a herd of 30 head. They bought more land from a neighbor who was retiring, expanding their holdings to 200 acres. They hired help during busy seasons, built a proper bunkhouse for ranch hands, and even added a second story to the house to accommodate their growing family. Margaret sometimes visited Thomas's grave on the hillside, bringing flowers and sitting in the quiet to talk to him about the children, about the ranch, about life. She felt no guilt now, only gratitude for the time they had shared and for the foundation he had helped her build. Garrett never objected to these visits, understanding that the past and present could coexist without diminishing either. On a warm evening in June of 1893, exactly 10 years after Clayton had first appeared with his fraudulent debt, Margaret and Garrett sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Sarah was 12 now, tall and responsible, helping her father with the horses. James was 7, all energy and questions. Emily was 5, chasing chickens with more enthusiasm than skill. "Do you ever think about that day in town?" Margaret asked. "When you paid for those broken eggs?" Garrett smiled, reaching for her hand. "Every day. Best money I ever spent." "You spent $2,000, not one silver dollar." "I would have spent 10 times that for this." Garrett gestured at the scene before them. The thriving ranch, the happy children, the life they had built together. "For you." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible during those dark days after Thomas's death. "Do you ever regret it? Giving up the wandering life?" "Not for a single moment. I found what I was looking for. I found home." He kissed the top of her head. "I found you." As the sun set over the New Mexico mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and pink, Margaret reflected on the strange paths life could take. She had been a terrified widow facing ruin, and now she was a wife and mother with a family she loved and a future that stretched bright before her. It had started with broken eggs in a dusty street and a cowboy with kind eyes who saw someone worth saving. Sometimes, Margaret thought, the best things in life came from the worst moments. Sometimes tragedy opened doors to joy that would otherwise have remained closed. And sometimes, when you thought your story was over, it was really just beginning. Inside the house, the cradle that Garrett had made 10 years ago sat in the corner of the main bedroom waiting. Margaret was pregnant again, though they had not told the children yet. This would be their last child, they had agreed. 4 was a good round number, a full and happy family. "What do you think this one will be?" Garrett asked, noticing the direction of her gaze. "I do not know, but it does not matter. Boy or girl, this child will be loved. They will grow up knowing they are wanted, that they belong, that they have a family who will stand with them no matter what." She turned to look at Garrett. "That is what you gave me, you know. Not just the ranch or the money or a way out of an impossible situation. You gave me family. You gave me belonging." "We gave it to each other," Garrett corrected. "I was alone for a long time before I met you, Margaret, drifting from place to place, never putting down roots, never letting anyone get too close. You changed that. You made me believe I could be something more than just a hired hand moving from job to job." They sat together as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. Inside the house, Mrs. Chen was preparing supper, the smells of cooking drifting through the open windows. The children's laughter echoed across the yard. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed contentedly. It was ordinary. It was perfect. It was everything. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Margaret and Garrett lay together in their bed, her head resting on his chest, his arms wrapped around her. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me that day in town, for caring when you had no reason to, for being patient while I healed, for loving me." "I will always love you," Garrett said, "from that first moment in the dusty street until my last breath. That is my promise to you." "And I will always love you," Margaret replied. "You saved me, Garrett Stone, in every way a person can be saved." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, dreaming of the future they would continue to build together. Outside, the New Mexico night was vast and starlit, full of possibility. The ranch that Margaret had almost lost stood solid and prosperous, a testament to determination and love and the unexpected ways life could turn around. In the years that followed, their 4th child was born, another son they named Daniel. The ranch continued to thrive, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. Sarah eventually married a young rancher from Santa Fe, and they built their own place on land that Margaret and Garrett gave them as a wedding gift. James developed a talent for working with horses and established a breeding program that brought buyers from as far away as Kansas. Emily, true to her independent nature, became a teacher and opened a school in Silverton, educating the children of miners and ranchers alike. Daniel, the youngest, stayed on the ranch and eventually took over its day-to-day operations, allowing Margaret and Garrett to slow down in their later years. On a spring morning in 1920, Garrett died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 67. Margaret held his hand as he passed, her tears falling on their joined fingers. He had been her companion, her partner, her love for 37 years. The loss was profound, but she did not regret a single day they had spent together. She lived for another 8 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren, active and sharp until the end. When she died in her sleep one winter night at the age of 69, her last thoughts were of Garrett waiting for her, and of Thomas welcoming her home, and of the beautiful, complicated, joyful life she had lived. The ranch stayed in the family for generations, passed down from Daniel to his children, and then to their children. The original house was expanded and modernized, but the bones of what Thomas built and Garrett preserved remained. The hillside cemetery grew to include Margaret and Garrett beside Thomas, their stones weathered by time and elements, but still standing strong. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light hit just right, you could almost see them. A determined young widow, a kind-eyed cowboy, and the love that had bloomed from broken eggs and desperate circumstances to become something lasting and true. Their story became part of the ranch's history, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. But those who knew the truth understood it was not a legend at all. It was simply the story of two people who found each other when they both needed finding, who built something beautiful from the ashes of loss, and who proved that sometimes the greatest love stories begin in the most unexpected ways, in dusty streets with broken eggs and a stranger's kindness that changed everything. The debt that Clayton claimed had threatened to destroy Margaret's life instead became the catalyst for something wonderful. Garrett's intervention had not just saved her ranch, it had saved her future, her happiness, her capacity to love again. And in saving her, he had saved himself, finding the home and family he had been searching for through all those lonely years on the trail. Their love had been born of hardship, but had flourished into something extraordinary. Through years of hard work, through the birth of children and the building of a legacy, through good times and bad, they had stood together. They had kept the promises they made on that first evening when they sat on the hillside overlooking the valley, planning a future neither of them had dared to hope for. In the end, what started as a business arrangement had become one of the great love stories of the New Mexico territory. Not because it was dramatic or tragic or doomed, but because it was real. It was two people choosing each other every day, building a life together, one moment at a time, finding joy in the ordinary and strength in the struggle. And that, more than anything, was what made their story worth telling. It was not about the debt that was paid or the brother-in-law who was sent away. It was about two hearts that found each other in the wilderness and decided to make a home together. It was about love that grew from kindness, trust that developed from honesty, and a partnership that proved stronger than any hardship. Margaret and Garrett Stone's story lived on long after they were gone, a reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures come from the darkest moments, and that love, real love, is always worth the wait, the work, and the leap of faith it takes to begin. Their descendants still tell the story of the cowboy who paid the debt and told the brother never to return, of the widow who found love again, of the family that grew from broken eggs and impossible circumstances. And every time the story is told, it ends the same way, with two people who loved each other, built a life together, and lived happily ever after in the wild, beautiful, unforgiving, and ultimately rewarding land of the New Mexico territory. The ranch stands still, a testament to their love. The land they fought for, the home they built, the family they raised, all of it remains generation after generation, proof that love and determination can overcome any obstacle. When the wind blows across the valley and rustles through the cottonwoods, when the sun sets in brilliant oranges and pinks over the mountains, when the stars come out bright and clear in the desert sky, their presence can still be felt. Margaret and Garrett Stone had lived, loved, and left a legacy that time could not erase. And in a world where so much was uncertain, where life could be harsh and unforgiving, they had created something permanent and good. They had taken broken pieces and made something whole. They had turned despair into hope, loneliness into companionship, and fear into love. That was their gift to each other and to all who came after them, proof that even in the wildest places, even in the hardest times, love could not just survive but thrive. It was a story worth remembering, worth retelling, worth honoring. A story of the Wild West, of cowboys and ranches, of danger faced and overcome, but most of all a story of love that endured through everything life could throw at it and emerged stronger for the trials. And so the story ends as all the best stories do. Not with a dramatic flourish or a tragic twist, but with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, a love well earned, and a legacy well established. Margaret and Garrett Stone had their happily ever after, hard-won and well-deserved, in the beautiful, brutal, breathtaking land they called home.